In every suburban neighborhood, there are unspoken hierarchies. Some families fit neatly into the HOA-approved mold, while others, intentionally or not, become the center of scrutiny. For Mark Renshaw, a hard-working mechanic who had poured his savings into restoring a massive lifted truck, that spotlight burned brighter than ever. His truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of years of sweat, determination, and the pride of building something with his own hands. But to the HOA, it was nothing more than an eyesore. The neighborhood had always been tightly controlled, with rules dictating everything from mailbox, colors to the length of grass in front lawns. But the HOA's attention sharpened when Mark parked his truck on his own driveway. It towered over the sedans and compact SUVs neatly lined in rows on his street, chrome gleaming under the sun. To Mark, it was beautiful. To the HOA board, especially its president, it was a direct violation of what they called the Aesthetic Harmony Clause. At first, the complaints arrived as polite letters. They were worded carefully, filled with phrases like community standards and visual conformity. Mark read them, shrugged, and placed them in a drawer. But as weeks turned into months, the tone escalated. Fines began to appear on his account, notices taped to his door, and threats of further legal action circulated in HOA newsletters. The board claimed his truck disrupted property values, that potential buyers wouldn't want to move into a neighborhood where such a monster vehicle dominated the view. Mark knew what was really happening. His truck had become the obsession of a select few, mainly Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She lived 2 houses down, her pristine beige siding and perfectly edged hedges standing as her personal badge of superiority. Karen thrived on control. She thrived on enforcing order. And now she saw Mark's truck as a challenge to her authority. What frustrated Mark most wasn't the letters or even the fines. It was the hypocrisy. Every morning, he watched Karen's son park his rusted-out hatchback halfway onto their lawn. He noticed another neighbor leave a faded RV trailer permanently stationed on the street, yet none of these violations received even a whisper of reprimand. Only his truck, gleaming spotless and proudly maintained, drew endless fire. Mark tried to play by the rules. He read the bylaws cover to cover, searching for the exact clause they cited. No vehicle of excessive size or unconventional appearance may be parked on visible property for extended periods. It was vague, deliberately so. Who decided what was excessive? Who defined unconventional? These words weren't rules, they were weapons, and Karen wielded them mercilessly. Soon, Karen escalated the fight by organizing a special HOA board meeting. Flyers appeared in mailboxes announcing the gathering. The stated purpose: address ongoing community concerns regarding non-compliant property. Everyone knew what that meant. Neighbors whispered, gossip spread, and all eyes turned toward Mark's driveway. Some shook their heads in sympathy. Others quietly sided with Karen, afraid of her wrath if they spoke out. Mark considered ignoring the meeting. After all, he wasn't required to attend. But something inside him stirred. Years of being pushed around by small-minded authority figures, years of watching hard-working people get bullied by those who hid behind. Titles and rules, it all began to boil. He realized this wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about dignity. That night, as he polished the chrome and tightened the last bolt on his pride and joy, an idea began to form. It wasn't rash. It wasn't reckless. It was calculated, a plan born from reading every line of the HOA bylaws. If they wanted to push him into a corner, he would show them just how far the rules could bend. The day of the meeting arrived, and tension hung thick in the air. Neighbors filed into the small community center, a beige building that mirrored the lifeless conformity the HOA prized so dearly. Inside, folding chairs, lined up before a long table where the board members sat like self-appointed judges. At the center, Karen sat upright, papers neatly stacked before her, eyes sharp and expectant. But Mark wasn't in the room yet. Instead, he was outside, engine idling. His lifted truck, tires nearly as tall as some of the children who played in the neighborhood, rumbled with a deep growl. Chrome mirrors reflected the community. Center's glass doors as he slowly maneuvered across the parking lot. The sign posted clearly read, HOA property parking permitted for residents. Nowhere did it forbid size. Nowhere did it forbid style. Neighbors turned their heads as the ground seemed to vibrate. Mark eased the truck toward the very front of the building, aligning it perfectly with the main entrance. His hood extended past the doors, chrome grille gleaming under fluorescent lights spilling from inside. The rumble silenced conversations mid-sentence, as every head turned toward the glass wall. Then, with deliberate calm, Mark shut off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. All that remained was the echo of his action, a quiet rebellion planted directly in the heart of HOA authority. Inside, Karen's face drained of color. Her carefully orchestrated meeting had just been hijacked by the very man she planned to shame. The neighbors who had gathered began whispering, some hiding smiles, others struggling not to laugh outright. In one move, Mark had turned the tables. His truck wasn't just parked in the neighborhood, it was parked in the HOA's own front yard, where they could do nothing but stare at the embodiment of everything they despised. Mark walked inside, calm, collected, and silent. He didn't need to say a word. His message was already there, gleaming outside those glass doors, impossible to ignore. For the first time, the HOA realized this battle wouldn't be one-sided. Mark wasn't going to be bullied quietly. He had just made his opening move. And as the murmurs grew louder in that small community hall, Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The truck sat like a monument outside the community hall, silent yet roaring with defiance. Its chrome reflected every passing glance, its sheer bulk casting a shadow over the carefully manicured shrubs, lining the HOA's prized property. For years, Karen Whitmore had prided herself on controlling every detail of the neighborhood's appearance, but now her own domain had been invaded by the very thing she sought to erase. Inside, the board meeting had started with stiff greetings and polite formalities. But Mark's entrance, timed perfectly with the presence of his truck looming outside, shattered the illusion of control. Karen cleared her throat repeatedly, shuffled her papers, and tried to proceed with the agenda. Yet her voice wavered, betraying the storm brewing beneath her polished exterior. The neighbors noticed. They always noticed. Some shifted in their seats with quiet amusement, secretly enjoying the crack in Karen's armor. Others sat rigid, afraid of what might follow. They had seen how Karen operated, how she turned petty complaints into crusades, how she singled out residents until they bent or broke. But Mark had just done what no one else dared. He embarrassed her in public. Karen attempted to steer the meeting back on course. She pointed to the printed agenda. Her tone clipped as she declared that community standards violations would be the first issue addressed. Yet every word she spoke was undercut by the undeniable presence of that truck outside. No one was listening to her carefully rehearsed speech about property values and neighborhood harmony. Everyone's attention was locked on the unspoken standoff between her authority and Mark's rebellion. Mark himself sat calmly in the back row, arms folded, expression unreadable. He didn't need to argue. He didn't need to defend himself. The truck outside was his statement, his silent testimony. The bylaws had been his study, and he knew the truth. Nothing he had done violated the written rules. He had parked legally on HOA property during an HOA event. The bylaws forbade loitering, vandalism, and blocking emergency exits. None of those applied. The loophole was airtight. Karen's frustration mounted. She raised her voice, citing aesthetic integrity and the importance of community. Pride. She waved the violation. Notices she had issued, stacking them dramatically before her as if the pile itself proved guilt. But the board members, usually her loyal chorus, remained strangely quiet. Some avoided her gaze, others shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the bylaws, too, and while they might not approve of Mark's towering vehicle, they couldn't deny that he was technically within his rights. The whispers grew. Neighbors leaned toward each other, muttering thoughts Karen could not control. Words like power trip and overreach floated through the air. Karen heard them, though none were spoken directly to her. She felt her authority slipping. The control she had cultivated for years, unraveling thread by thread. Finally, unable to contain herself, Karen declared that the truck represented a clear and present danger to property, values, and demanded immediate removal. Her voice echoed across the room, sharp and desperate. But when no one moved, when no volunteer stepped forward to back her call, The silence grew heavy. It was the silence of doubt, of neighbors questioning whether Karen's crusade was truly about the community or about her personal vendetta. The meeting limped forward after that, but the damage was done. Every topic raised, budget allocations, landscaping contracts, maintenance schedules, was overshadowed by the looming symbol outside. By the time the gathering adjourned, Karen's usual dominance had been reduced to shaky notes and forced smiles. The neighbors filed out quietly, passing the truck with lingering glances. Some smirked, some shook their heads, but all of them understood one thing. Something had shifted in the balance of power. Mark stayed seated until the last of them had gone. When he finally rose, he did so without hurry. He walked past the board table, past Karen's rigid figure, and stepped outside into the night. The truck gleamed under the parking lot lights, waiting for him like a loyal sentinel. He climbed in, started the engine, and the deep rumble filled the air once more. Without a word, he pulled away, leaving behind an HOA board more fractured than it had ever been. But the fallout didn't end with the meeting. Over the next few days, the neighborhood buzzed with conversation. The story spread from porch to porch, from mailbox to mailbox. Everyone had an opinion. Some praised Mark for standing up to Karen, calling his move clever, even heroic. Others whispered about the consequences, worried that Karen would double down in her crusade for control. Karen herself was furious. Behind closed doors, she drafted emails to the HOA board, demanding emergency sessions, urging legal counsel, and proposing new amendments to the bylaws. If she couldn't win under the current rules, she would rewrite them. But pushing through changes required time, votes, and a level of support she no longer commanded with certainty. The board members were shaken. Some feared that siding with her would only deepen the divide. Others worried about lawsuits if they overstepped their authority. Mark, meanwhile, continued his life as though nothing unusual had happened. He drove his truck to work, parked it proudly in his driveway, and waved at neighbors who honked or gave him quiet thumbs up as they passed. He didn't need to boast about what he had done. The story spoke for itself. And the more Karen raged, the more she exposed her own obsession. The quiet war had shifted. It was no longer simply about a truck. It was about control, about pride, about who truly held power in the neighborhood. For years, Karen had dictated the rules unchecked. Now, for the first time, she had an opponent who wouldn't bend and who had the community's attention. Days later, as the sun set behind rows of identical houses, Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, eyes locked on Mark's driveway. The truck gleamed in the fading light, a constant reminder of her failure. She told herself it wasn't over, that she would find a way to restore order. But deep down, she felt the uneasy truth. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and Mark had just pried her fingers loose. The battle lines were drawn. The next move would decide whether Karen regained her throne or whether Mark's quiet defiance would inspire the neighborhood to finally push back the days. Following the infamous board meeting did not cool the fire. If anything, the quiet buzz of conversation only fanned the flames. What Mark had done spread faster than gossip about a foreclosure. Within a week, neighbors from blocks away had walked past his driveway just to catch a glimpse of the truck that had humiliated the HOA. Some even slowed their cars to snap photos. The story became neighborhood legend, a tale whispered with awe and retold with laughter. But for Karen Whitmore, the HOA president, it was no laughing matter. She had ruled her community with precision for years, enforcing every clause, every line, every expectation. People obeyed not because they wanted to, but because they feared what happened if they didn't. Her word had been final, until now. Mark's defiance had fractured her authority, and the fracture threatened to spread like a crack through glass. Karen's counterattack began quietly. She called an emergency session with her board members. The emails she sent were lengthy and urgent, written in capital letters and underlined phrases. She demanded swift action, insisting that Mark's stunt was a threat to the integrity of their neighborhood. If they did not act, she warned, others would follow his example. Soon there would be chaos. Oversized vehicles, unapproved paint colors, maybe even, she shuddered, front yard gardens. The board members listened, but their enthusiasm was muted. Some were still rattled by the scene at the last meeting, unwilling to provoke more ridicule. Others had quietly enjoyed watching Karen squirm, though none dared admit it aloud. Still, Karen pressed forward. If she could not defeat Mark with the rules as they stood, she would change the rules. She drafted a new amendment to the bylaws. This one banned any vehicle exceeding specific dimensions from being parked in driveways or visible areas for more than 24 hours. She worded it meticulously, choosing measurements that perfectly excluded Mark's lifted truck while sparing the compact SUVs and family vans owned by others. To Karen, it was elegant precision. To anyone looking closely, it was targeted warfare, but Karen underestimated her neighbors. By now, the community had seen her obsession. They had witnessed how far she would go to crush one man's pride, and they didn't like it. When the proposal reached mailboxes, residents muttered their disapproval. Some openly laughed, pointing out the absurdity of measuring vehicles with tape just to satisfy Karen's vendetta. Others quietly threw the papers away, unwilling to play her game. Mark received his copy too, of course. He read the amendment carefully, shaking his head at its obvious intent. But rather than grow angry, he smiled. Karen's desperation had become predictable. He knew she would keep pushing, keep reaching further until she overextended herself. All he had to do was wait and watch. The tighter she gripped the rules, the more they slipped through her fingers. Still, Karen pressed forward. She went door to door, clipboard in hand, demanding signatures in support of her new bylaw. She spoke of protecting property, values, and preserving harmony, her tone sharp and persuasive. Yet doors began to close on her more often than they opened. Neighbors nodded politely, offered vague promises, and then failed to sign. Some even told her directly that they wouldn't support, a rule that clearly targeted one person. The tide was turning. What Karen saw as righteous leadership, others now saw as obsession. For years, they had tolerated her controlling nature. Now, with Mark's truck as the spark, they began questioning why they had allowed it for so long. But Karen refused to see the shift. To her, every rejection was treachery, every hesitation a personal betrayal. She doubled down, filing formal complaints against Mark with city zoning offices, hoping to trap him in some obscure regulation. She photographed his truck from multiple angles, sending images with highlighted notes to the HOA's lawyer. She even whispered rumors at neighborhood gatherings, claiming Mark's vehicle was unsafe, that it leaked oil, that it was a hazard to children. Yet nothing stuck. The city inspectors found no violations. The lawyer warned that the amendment would be difficult to enforce, without sparking lawsuits. And as for the rumors, neighbors had seen the truck up close, polished to perfection, maintained with care. The lies dissolved in the face of reality. Mark, meanwhile, remained calm. He worked his shifts, mowed his lawn, and waved at neighbors who increasingly waved back. He didn't need to confront Karen directly. Her own actions were undoing her reputation faster than anything he could have planned. Each time she lashed out, she revealed herself. And each time she revealed herself, the neighborhood's respect eroded further. But Karen wasn't finished. Her obsession had taken root too deeply. In her mind, this wasn't just about a truck anymore. It was about her authority, her legacy, her place as the unchallenged ruler of the community. She convinced herself that if she could defeat Mark, she could restore the order she had built. So she escalated once again. She scheduled another HOA meeting, this time framing it as a decisive vote on her proposed amendment. Flyers appeared on doors, promising residents the chance to protect their investments. Karen spent days preparing her speech, rehearsing it in front of mirrors, timing her pauses for dramatic effect. But Mark had been preparing too. He hadn't forgotten the loopholes in the bylaws, and he hadn't forgotten how the last meeting had turned the tide in his favor. Karen wanted another public battle, and he was more than willing to give her one. As the night of the meeting approached, tension thickened. Neighbors whispered about what might happen. Some speculated Karen would finally get her way. Others predicted another humiliation. One thing was certain: the standoff had grown beyond a simple dispute. It had become a symbol of control versus resistance, of freedom versus authority. And when the doors of the community hall opened once more, the stage was set for a clash that would decide more than just the fate of one lifted truck. It would decide who truly ruled the neighborhood. The night of the second meeting arrived like a storm cloud. The community center, usually half empty for HOA gatherings, was overflowing. Word had spread about the showdown, and curiosity brought out neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years. Folding chairs were added hastily, lining the walls and corners. The air was charged with anticipation, every whisper carrying the weight of expectation. At the front, the HOA board sat stiffly behind their long table, papers stacked in neat piles. Some avoided eye contact with the crowd, others fidgeted nervously. At the center sat Karen Whitmore, her posture rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wore a blazer a shade darker than the beige of the walls, as if blending into the conformity she so cherished. Her eyes scanned the crowd like a general surveying a battlefield. Karen's speech was ready. She had spent nights crafting it, layering it with statistics, property value reports, and emotional appeals. To her, this was not just a presentation. It was a final attempt to seize back the authority she felt slipping from her grasp. She tapped her papers, waiting for the chatter to die down, then rose to her feet. Her voice carried with practiced confidence. She spoke of community pride, of maintaining standards, of protecting investments. She framed the proposed bylaw amendment not as an attack on one resident, but as a necessary safeguard against declining appearances. She painted a picture of chaos, streets lined with oversized vehicles, yards cluttered with trailers, the neighborhood reduced to disorder. To some, her words sounded polished, persuasive. To others, they rang hollow, a desperate attempt to mask her obsession. But Karen was not prepared for what came next. As she delivered her speech, the faint rumble of an engine grew louder outside. At first, people dismissed it as passing traffic, but the sound deepened, vibrating the walls of the community center. Heads turned toward the glass doors at the front, where light from the parking lot spilled inside. And then they saw it. Mark's truck rolled into view, larger than life, chrome gleaming under the floodlights. But this time, it wasn't alone. He had polished it to a mirror shine and mounted a large banner across its side, neatly printed with words from the HOA bylaws themselves. Residents may park vehicles on HOA property during official meetings without restriction. The room erupted in murmurs. Some gasped, others chuckled, a few outright laughed. Karen froze mid-sentence, her face draining of color. The very rule she had tried to twist against Mark now stood displayed for all to see, written in bold black letters on the side of his truck. Mark didn't storm inside. He didn't need to. He simply parked the truck at the front entrance again, this time angled so that the banner faced directly into the room. Then he shut off the engine, leaving silence in its wake. His move was silent, legal, and devastatingly effective. Inside, Karen struggled to regain control. Her voice wavered as she tried to dismiss the stunt, calling it disrespectful and immature. She raised her voice, pounding the table, insisting that this only proved her point about unsightly disruptions. But the damage was done. Every eye in the room was glued to the banner. Every ear was deaf to her anger. Neighbors began whispering again, louder this time. Some leaned back in their chairs, smiling at the boldness of Mark's move. Others nodded quietly, recognizing the cleverness of using the HOA's own rules against them. And slowly, the whispers turned into something more: resistance. When the time came for residents to voice their opinions, the shift was undeniable. One after another, neighbors stood to oppose Karen's amendment. They spoke not just of the truck, but of fairness, of selective enforcement, of years of living under arbitrary rules. They spoke of fines that felt personal, of letters that seemed threatening, of being afraid to step out of line. Mark's defiance had given them courage, and the floodgates opened. Karen's jaw tightened as each voice chipped away at her authority. Her carefully rehearsed arguments crumbled under the weight of real grievances. She interrupted, snapped, tried to redirect, but the room no longer belonged to her. For years, she had dominated meetings with her sharp tongue and iron grip. Now, her words fell flat, met with crossed arms and skeptical stares. Finally, the vote was called. Karen sat upright, clinging to the belief that she could still salvage control. But when the ballots were counted, the result was clear. Her amendment failed by a wide margin. The room erupted in quiet applause, a sound that echoed louder than any speech she had given. Mark didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply remained seated at the back, calm and collected. His truck had spoken for him, and the community had listened. The battle wasn't won with anger or shouting, but with patience, preparation, and the very rules Karen had tried to twist. But Karen was not ready to concede. As the meeting ended and neighbors filed out, she sat frozen at the table, her eyes locked on Mark. In her mind, this wasn't defeat, it was betrayal. She told herself the board had failed her, the neighbors had turned on her, and Mark had manipulated them all. She wasn't beaten, she told herself. Not yet. Outside, the truck sat gleaming under the lights, the banner still proudly displayed. Neighbors passed it with quiet admiration, some snapping photos, others patting Mark on the back as they left. For the first time in years, the HOA had been challenged, and the challenger had won. But victory came with a cost. Karen's obsession, now wounded, would only grow darker. The neighborhood had pushed back, but she still held the title of president, and in her mind, she had nothing left to lose. The war wasn't over. It was only escalating. Defeat had a taste, and for Karen Whitmore, it was bitter beyond measure. The failed amendment vote hung in her mind like a stain she could not scrub away. For years, she had ruled the HOA with an iron grip, her decisions unchallenged, her word final. Now, for the first time, the neighbors she once commanded had defied her. And worse, they had applauded her enemy. The image of Mark's truck, gleaming under the community hall's lights with the bylaws plastered across its side, replayed in her mind endlessly. She saw it every time she closed her eyes, every time she glanced out her window toward his driveway. It wasn't just a vehicle. It had become a symbol, a monument to her failure. Karen's obsession deepened. She began spending long nights at her desk, poring over rule books, municipal codes, and zoning ordinances. She scoured websites, filed inquiries, and contacted city officials. If she couldn't beat Mark with HOA rules, she would find another avenue. She convinced herself that somewhere, hidden in the dense language of bureaucracy, was a weapon sharp enough to cut him down. Her first attempt was environmental. She filed a complaint alleging that Mark's truck leaked hazardous fluids onto his driveway, posing a danger to the soil and groundwater. Inspectors came, clipboards in hand. But when they examined the driveway, they found nothing. Mark, meticulous as always, kept his truck spotless. The complaint was dismissed. Next, Karen tried noise ordinances. She argued that the truck's engine was excessively loud, disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. But the city measured decibel levels and found them within legal limits. Another rejection. Frustrated, Karen turned to intimidation. Anonymous letters began appearing in Mark's mailbox, typed in all caps, warning of serious consequences if he didn't remove the truck. Mark knew instantly who was behind them. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge them, but he kept the letters neatly filed away. Evidence, should he ever need it. The neighbors noticed, too. They saw Karen lurking near his property, phone in hand, snapping photos of his driveway at odd hours. They saw her standing at board meetings, her voice trembling with rage, her eyes scanning the crowd for allies that no longer raised their hands. Where once she had commanded respect, now she drew whispers and sideways glances. The queen of the neighborhood had become its pariah. Mark, meanwhile, remained steady. He worked his hours at the shop, came home, and tended to his property. He waved at neighbors, shared casual conversations, and ignored the storm raging across the street. But beneath his calm exterior, he was preparing. He knew Karen wouldn't stop. He knew her desperation would eventually drive her to a breaking point. And when that moment came, he wanted to be ready. It wasn't about the truck anymore. It was about principle. For Mark, the battle represented something larger: the right to live without being suffocated by pettiness, the right to stand tall against unfair control. His truck had become the symbol of that fight, and he would defend it to the end. Karen's breaking point arrived one humid summer night. Sitting at her desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and rejection letters, she realized her authority was slipping away entirely. Her board no longer backed her unconditionally. The neighbors had begun to question her judgment. If she failed to reassert control soon, her reign would collapse. That night, she drafted a final plan. She would call an emergency session, not to propose new rules, but to demand a recall vote against Mark. She framed it as a matter of community safety, alleging that his truck created hazards for pedestrians, obscured views for drivers, and endangered children playing nearby. She didn't have proof, but she no longer cared. Proof, she told herself, was secondary to perception. Flyers appeared in mailboxes the next morning announcing the special safety session. Karen hoped fear would rally support where her arguments had failed. She hoped the word safety would frighten hesitant neighbors into compliance. But when the night arrived, the community hall told a different story. Residents filled the chairs, not with fear, but with defiance. They had grown tired of Karen's crusade. They had seen her obsession consume her credibility. And now, many came not to support her, but to witness what they sensed would be her final unraveling. Karen rose to speak, her voice sharp, her eyes wild with determination. She painted dire pictures of accidents waiting to happen, of lawsuits looming over the neighborhood, of children's lives at risk because of one man's selfishness. She gestured dramatically, pounding the table for emphasis. But her theatrics no longer inspired. They repelled. Mark sat quietly at the back, his expression calm. He didn't bring banners this time, didn't roll his truck to the door. He didn't need to. The community had already seen through Karen's charade. Her words rang hollow against the weight of her history, her pattern of control, her endless targeting of one man for daring to live differently. When Karen called for a vote, the response was swift. Hands did not rise in her favor. Instead, murmurs filled the room, followed by a motion from the floor, a motion to remove Karen herself as president of the HOA. The suggestion spread like wildfire, gaining momentum with every second. The board, cornered and weary of her obsession, agreed to put it to a vote. The tally was decisive. Karen, once untouchable, was removed from her throne in a single evening. Gasps filled the room as she sat stunned, her face pale, her papers trembling in her hands. For years she had ruled through fear. Now, her reign ended in humiliation. Mark didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded quietly as neighbors turned toward him with smiles of relief. The fight wasn't his anymore. It was theirs. The neighborhood had chosen to free itself. But even as Karen gathered her papers with shaking hands and stormed out of the hall, Mark knew this wasn't quite the end. People like her rarely surrendered gracefully. She had lost her title, but not her obsession. One last confrontation still loomed, and when it came, Mark was ready. The night Karen Whitmore was voted out as president of the HOA should have been the end. The neighborhood had spoken, her authority stripped, her allies evaporated. For most, that would have been the final curtain. But Karen was not most people. For her, the loss was not closure. It was humiliation, and humiliation demanded revenge. In the days following her removal, she withdrew from public view. Neighbors saw less of her strutting down the street with her clipboard, less of her patrolling driveways with a scowl. Instead, she remained inside her house with curtains drawn, venturing out only briefly to collect her mail or wheel her trash bins to the curb. But behind those closed blinds, she was plotting. Karen's obsession with Mark's truck had become an anchor she couldn't cut loose. It was no longer about bylaws or aesthetics. It was personal, and the sting of public disgrace only sharpened her fixation. She told herself that if she couldn't win back the boardroom, she would settle her score another way. Her plan was reckless. In the dead of night, while the neighborhood slept, Karen crept toward Mark's property with a can of industrial paint in her hands. She had convinced herself that if she couldn't remove the truck through rules, she would scar it beyond repair. A childish act of vengeance, but in her unraveling mind, it felt like justice. But fate, as it often does, had other designs. That night, Mark was awake later than usual, tinkering in his garage. He had noticed Karen's increasingly erratic behavior and suspected she might lash out. Quietly, he had installed motion sensor cameras and lights around his property. And so when Karen stepped into his driveway, the sensors triggered instantly. Floodlights snapped on, cameras began recording, and the entire scene lit up like a stage. Karen froze, paint can in hand, caught in the act. For a moment, she considered fleeing, but the damage was done. Mark emerged from the garage, calm and deliberate. He didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply stood in the doorway, arms crossed, while the cameras captured every incriminating second. The next morning, the footage made its way to the new HOA board. By noon, the entire neighborhood had seen it. Any lingering sympathy for Karen vanished instantly. Parents whispered about her being unhinged. Couples shook their heads at how far she had fallen. Even her closest former allies refused to defend her. But Mark did not press charges. He could have, and no one would have blamed him. Yet he chose a different path. He shared the footage only with the board and the neighbors most directly affected. His message was clear. He wasn't seeking revenge. He simply wanted peace. The community, however, drew its own conclusions. They decided it was time to cut Karen off entirely. Within weeks, a petition circulated to revoke her HOA membership privileges permanently. Without the ability to vote, speak at meetings, or serve on committees, Karen was reduced to little more than a resident with no influence. The board approved the measure overwhelmingly, citing her pattern of disruptive and destructive behavior. Mark, meanwhile, continued life as usual. His truck remained parked proudly in his driveway, polished and gleaming, a monument not only to his perseverance, but also to the neighborhood's victory over tyranny. What began as one man's defiance had become a symbol of collective resistance, a reminder that no single individual, no matter how loud or controlling, could dictate the lives of everyone else. The neighbors often remarked on the irony. The more Karen fought against that truck, the more it came to represent freedom. What she intended as an eyesore had instead become a point of pride for the community. Some even joked about it, calling it the people's truck, laughing at how one lifted pickup had toppled a reign of fear. But for Mark, it was never about the laughs or the recognition. Standing beside his truck one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold and crimson, he thought back on the journey, the complaints, the fines, the intimidation, the late-night plotting. It had all led here. He hadn't just defended a vehicle. He had defended his right to live without being bullied by someone drunk on power. The final word belonged not to Karen, but to the neighborhood itself. At the next annual HOA meeting, the new board passed a resolution. It was simple but symbolic. Residents were free to park personal vehicles of any size in their own driveways, provided they complied with city codes. It was, in essence, a declaration of independence. The resolution passed unanimously, a line drawn forever against the kind of petty tyranny Karen had tried to enforce. Karen remained in the neighborhood, though diminished and ignored. She drove past Mark's driveway often, her jaw tight, her eyes darting toward the truck she had once waged war against. But she no longer had a platform, no longer had a voice. The neighbors no longer feared her clipboard or her letters. She had become a ghost of authority, a relic of a chapter the community had closed. For Mark, the matter was finished. He no longer needed to fight because the fight had been won, not by him alone, but by everyone who chose to resist unfair control. His truck remained where it had always been, not as an act of defiance anymore, but simply as part of his life. And yet to anyone walking past, it stood taller than just steel and paint. It was a silent reminder. When pushed by injustice, sometimes all it takes is one person standing firm to inspire everyone else to push back too. The HOA said his truck was an eyesore, but in the end, it was Karen's obsession, not his vehicle, that truly scarred the neighborhood. The truck remained. She did not. And so the story closed, with one lifted pickup resting in its rightful place, gleaming proudly in the driveway, a monument not to defiance alone, but to victory, freedom, and the downfall of a tyrant undone by her own obsession. And that, folks, is how one so-called eyesore truck brought an entire HOA dictatorship to its knees. What started as a petty complaint spiraled into a full-blown power struggle, and in the end, the tyrant who thought she could control everyone ended up destroying her own reign. It's funny when you think about it. Karen believed that by targeting Mark's truck, she could enforce her vision of perfection on the neighborhood. But instead, all she did was expose her obsession, her desperation, and her true character. Every scheme, every complaint, every failed attempt only made the community stronger, and Mark's truck prouder. This wasn't just about a vehicle. It was about standing up when someone tries to push you around. It was about drawing a line when authority is abused. And it was about proving that sometimes the simplest acts of defiance, like parking your truck where you've always parked it, can spark change far bigger than you ever imagined. Karen lost everything she clung to. The clipboard, the title, the fear she once commanded, all gone. And the neighborhood she thought she controlled, they laughed, they cheered, and they moved on without her. Meanwhile, Mark didn't just win, he proved a point, that fairness, patience, and persistence will always outlast petty tyranny. His truck became more than a vehicle, it became a symbol, and whether Karen liked it or not, it became part of the neighborhood's identity, standing tall as a reminder that freedom can't be bullied into silence. So the next time you hear about an HOA overstepping its bounds, or a Karen trying to control every detail of someone else's life, remember this story. Remember the truck that stood tall. And remember that sometimes the best revenge isn't shouting or fighting or stooping to their level. Sometimes the best revenge is parking your truth right in their front office and letting it speak louder than they ever could. Because in the end, justice doesn't always arrive with a gavel. Sometimes it arrives on 4 wheels, lifted high, gleaming in the sun, too big to ignore and too right to remove. And that's the end of this story, but not the end of stories like it.